Hello, and welcome to Unearthing History, Densho's 2024 virtual fundraiser. My name is Nina Wallace. I'm Densho's Media and Outreach Manager.
And hi, I'm Cassandra Hishida. I'm Densho's Development Manager.
And we're very excited that you all can join us here tonight. We're going to be, or actually, before we get into our program, we wanted to keep things like a little cozy this year, so we actually wanted to invite everyone into our own space. So we're joining you live from Densho's office here in Seattle's historic Chinatown International District. We actually have a small studio audience of some Densho staff and friends, so shout out to our live friends. I don't want to give too much away of our program, but we're going to be joined in a little bit by the co-editors and translator of the Literature of Japanese American Incarceration, which is a really incredible new anthology. So we'll be joined in a little bit by Frank Abe, Andrew Leong, and Floyd Chung. We'll hear from them in a little bit, and then we're also going to be hearing some reflections on the past, present, future of Densho from our current Executive Director, Naomi Ostwald Kawamura, as well as our founding Executive Director, Tom Ikeda.
And of course, before we start, we just want to take a moment to ground in gratitude. As a community-driven nonprofit, everything that Densho does and has built to this point is because of our incredible network of supporters and partners. So for everyone in the audience and for everyone who's donated, thank you so much. We really appreciate your support and for making not just this evening possible, but all of our work to preserve and share history, and for this community and network that we're part of. So with that, just thank you again, and thank you for spending your time with us, and we're ready to hear from Tom, so we'll pass it to Tom Ikeda, our founding director, and his first appearance on a Densho screen to you in about 2 years now. So thank you.
Hey everyone. For those of you who don't recognize me, I'm Tom Ikeda, and it's been 2 years since my last Densho public event, and I'm just so glad to be here. And people often ask me, so Tom, what have you been doing these past 2 years? And I was thinking about that over the years, and it's nothing really earth-shattering. I think about what's been happening, and the biggest thing is stepping down as executive director has just given me more time to tend to personal things. In particular, having the time, focus, and energy to really be with family, which has been really rewarding. I mean, spending time an afternoon in the yard, just working out. People laugh and they say, I really have gotten into cooking. And the other thing that I find a lot of joy is actually having the time to read books, actually physical books, and at night, not being so tired that I just, my head hits the pillow and I fall asleep, but to actually be able to read for an hour, and I just really, really enjoy that. So those are some of the things that I've been doing the past 2 years. Naomi Kawamura, the current executive director, and I, meet on a regular basis, and my role is to really be a sounding board for her, to really listen to what she's thinking and wants to do, and I just listen and at times give advice. And I remember this 2-year period. 2 years ago, I think I sort of take for granted that over the first 28 years of Densho, how much knowledge about partners, about donors, about staff, about how we do things, I had accumulated. And I remember those early days when I was talking to Naomi, it was just like almost overwhelming in terms of the amount of information. And over time, over these 2 years, as we met and as she has worked on different projects, have to deal with difficult situations, good situations. I've watched her just sort of absorb more and more information, just really rapidly. She's such a quick study. And one of the reasons we were so excited about Naomi was her experience and knowledge in education. And she was talking about how she could take all of this work we had accumulated for almost 30 years, all these primary sources, our knowledge about what we the importance of this information, and she was thinking of ways of reaching much broader audiences with this. And as I listened to her, I remember, kind of smiling at her and says, Naomi, I mean, you really get this. I mean, you really have not only absorbed what we're doing and the significance, in some ways even framed it differently than how I looked at it, but in a really interesting way. And you're going to build on that with education. And so when people ask me, so how is Densho doing? I can't help but say I'm so excited that there are so many very cool things just on the horizon that are going to be emerging that actually I think it took 2 years for her to just really understand what we had done. Not only the content, but the culture, our role in the community. And she's done just such a sensitive, sort of approach to all this, very intentional. And now she's building on this, so it's going to be very, very exciting. I'm sitting in a very special place for me. I'm sitting in the historic Nippon-kan Theater. And in Seattle, this was a very special place for the Japanese American community. Personally, I was married here almost exactly 40 years ago. And so, to my wife and, hi, Sarah, I just wanted to say hi. Also, about 30 years ago, this was where Densho had its first public event, where we unveiled, kind of our vision and actually had this multimedia demonstration of our archive and what we were doing that, for the first time the community could see it. And that was a very exciting time. But more than those two things, what I love about this space are the stories that, as I walk around, this place actually comes alive. And that came alive from the stories we had heard from the community, from our elders. There are a lot of stories about the events that happened here and why, this was such an important place. But the part I love about the Densho process was we really try to extract the everyday stories, the feelings, what people were thinking about. And there was this one story that I remember from a elderly man who talked about coming here as a young teenager. And he was there, sort of captivated by the performances. But he also loved to come to just watch the people. And he was telling this story about how he would come and there was this one glamorous woman who was an actress on stage. And she had this boyfriend who was, frankly, a gangster in the community. And so he would kind of watch them. And every once in a while, he would tell the story of how the gangster would kind of open up his waistcoat, and on his side there was a revolver, a gun. And he was always just shocked, just wide-eyed. And it was just like this, as he told, this movie happening in terms of, the hubbub of everything going on. And those are the things that I so appreciate about Densho. It's really the stories that really, I think, make a community. Which in some ways, in talking to you in terms of what others can do in terms of history, people talk about the power of stories, and a lot of historic organizations, do oral histories, and they do it to preserve. But listening to personal stories is much more than preserving history. And what I do just every day is, when I'm out and about, not just with Japanese Americans, but anyone, just ask people their story. And it may seem like this trivial thing, but more than preserving history, stories actually connect us as communities. We get to know each other. People are seen when you ask them their story. As I do this, I sometimes come across like this incredible story. Someone tells me that, and they may be telling for the first time about something that happened in their family or an event that they went through. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is so important. This needs to be heard by others. And so this is where Densho can come in. And so as you're about, not just in Seattle, but any city that you're in, and you hear these important stories, in particular about the Japanese American community, send me an email. My email is the same, tom.ikeda@densho.org. Send it to me because Densho is still doing interviews. I'm helping them doing oral history interviews. This is a passion of mine. And also, I want to help other communities collect and preserve these stories. Just like I talked about the Nippon-kan in Seattle, there are other places in other cities, other towns, other communities across the country that we should also be preserving, and you can help us there. So that's just one little thing, but start with just practicing by just talking to people and asking their story.
Well, thank you, Tom, for taking a break from your busy retirement life and sharing some words of encouragement. I know for me, it's really nice to see him so relaxed after working so hard.
I'm so glad he's still got it. I mean, Tom is just the same, right? Same Tom, still same hand movements, same blue shirt. But I'm glad that he is still staying close to the organization. And I was worried he'd go off on some existential tangent with his life because he said, "You don't know what I'm going to do next." But no, he's still staying close. I'm glad because it's important for the organization.
Yeah,
right?
no, we're really grateful to have him still, kind of contributing his guidance and insight, and forever and always a part of Densho.
Thank you, Tom.
But as you can see, I'm now joined by writer, researcher, and of course co-editor of the Literature of Japanese American Incarceration, Frank Abe. So welcome, Frank.
Thanks, Nina. Thank you all for being here.
And thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Well, I'm going to LA tomorrow, and I'm going to see Brian Nia. We're launching the book at Janum Saturday at 2 p.m. if you want to come out. Yeah.
We so appreciate you being here with us tonight. And
Well, no, Densho, I've made the rounds this summer, all the Japanese American museums and pilgrimages and affinity groups. But I live in Seattle. Densho is, Seattle's my home, and Densho is like my home team. I mean, really very special to me. We took great care in our work to put the book together, and I appreciate about Densho. I think is the intellectual rigor that you guys put into the archiving and the interpretation of the material, both in the encyclopedia and all the other things you do. So I mean, really, I tell everyone, and in our books, we don't have to put glossaries in our books, in my books of Issei, Nisei, Sansei. I just say, you got a question? Go to densho.org. You learn the ABCs, you get a glossary, and all the background information. And encyclopedia has everything else that you want to know, so it's all there.
Well,
so thank you.
Very high praise. Thank you. I know as we were kind of brainstorming the theme for this event tonight, we sort of kept coming back to this idea of unearthing history and kind of finding these stories and voices that have been buried for so long, and bringing them to light so more people can hear them and engage with them. So I really want to thank you, Frank, for being here tonight, and also, Floyd and Andrew, who, unfortunately couldn't be here with us live tonight, but very generously contributed from afar. I'm so excited to hear more about this anthology.
We'll hear from Floyd first. He's in Massachusetts, explain how the book got started and his approach to the selections. Andrew Leong, UC Berkeley. He'll talk about creating the 2 original translations that we commissioned from him for the literary magazine at Tule Lake. And I'll come back later to kind of tie it all together.
Yep, and we'll have a live Q&A towards the end too, so as you're listening, if you come up with questions, feel free to drop those in the chat and we'll get to them later. With that, let's hear from Floyd and Andrew.
Hello, I'm Floyd Chung, Vice President for Equity and Inclusion and Professor of English and American Studies at Smith College. Over the years, I have edited several volumes by and about forgotten and lesser-known Asian American writers, mainly between the 1880s and 1960s. This work of recovery has been my attempt to diversify and deepen the American literary canon. By attending to these literary voices, I hope that we can develop a more inclusive communal imagination of who counts as American. When Elda Rotor, Vice President of Penguin Books, asked me to contribute to her vision of incorporating more Asian American texts in the venerable white-striped, black-covered series all of us know as Penguin Classics, I leapt at the chance. I propose turning the reader that I use when I teach about the Japanese American incarceration at Smith College into an anthology. My course reader juxtaposed key government documents with writings by Japanese Americans in order to give students a sense of the dynamism of history and the varied perspectives of those who were affected. the literature of Japanese American incarceration includes not only poetry, drama, and fiction, but also first-person accounts, letters, and graphic narratives. In terms of an angle, I settled on accenting voices of resistance. I realized early on, however, that the work would benefit from taking on a partner with close ties to the Japanese American community and with expertise in resistance. The book cover image that Frank and I chose depicts resistance by Japanese Americans at the camp in Poston by Disney illustrator turned incarceree Gene Sogioka. The incarceration and its aftermath unfolded over many years and went through various phases. In the section named Arrest and Alien Internment, we sought to convey how surprised Japanese Americans were when they learned of the Imperial Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Long before he wrote the novel No Boy, John Okada anonymously published a poem entitled I Must Be Strong. We decided to include 5 selections on the U.S. roundup of Japanese American elders and leaders, because this stage of wartime experience is sometimes conflated with the mass removal of Japanese American populations from the West Coast. In the days and weeks following the attack on Pearl Harbor, many business owners, teachers, priests, and other community leaders were literally interned, that is, imprisoned as alien threats to the state during a time of war. The next section, Cooperation and Refusal, kicks off with Executive Order 9066, the first of several government documents in the volume. To recreate the conditions for dialogic study in our volume, we placed Japanese American voices of principled refusal next to those of accommodationist cooperation. This leads us to the heart of the book, Part 2, simply called The Camps. They did not know what was going to happen to them or how long the war would last. Confusion and doubt coexisted with resolution and readiness. A longer section, entitled Deserts and Swamps, focuses on the various locations and conditions of the 10 main camps. Recent scholars of incarceration have pointed attention to the fact that many of these centers were built on or adjacent to Native American reservations. Hence, some of our selections include references to Japanese American and Native American interaction. The full text of the government document, commonly called the Loyalty Questionnaire, kicks off the section entitled Registration and Segregation. We wanted to reprint the entire questionnaire so that readers could ascertain what Japanese American incarcerees had to grapple with. The incarcerees at Topaz, for instance, refused to fill out the form until the government answered their questions about it, and we reprint their reasoning. The literature of this section gives us a sense of the diversity of reactions and attendant consequences. In the next section, Volunteers and the Draft, we share the work of those who believed that fighting for the U.S. would be a sign of loyalty. But we also encounter the voices of mothers who insisted on knowing that their sons' lives would not be spent in vain. After Camp is the title of Part 3. Here, we devote one section entitled Resettlement and Reconnection to first-person accounts of return to former homes. Other pieces in this section are by more recent writers, some of whom never experienced the incarceration directly. These Sansei and Yonce writers build their work on half-told tales and small details to reconnect with their elders' histories. The Redress section provides actual and fictionalized accounts of some of the key moments that led to the measure of justice signified by the letter of apology from President George H.W. Bush, which for some meant more than the $20,000 checks issued to surviving incarcerees. Tracy Kato Kiriyama's poem, No Redress, however, takes issue with the government's overdue action, since her grandfather was among those who did not live long enough to receive a check or apology. The final section of the book, Repeating History, gathers recent works that attest to the fact that race-based, federally sanctioned injustice continues in spite of the best efforts of activists and well-meaning civil servants. witnessed the ban on immigration from Muslim countries and the separation of migrant families at the southern U.S. border, for instance. The book ends, however, with selected pages from the graphic novel We Hereby Refuse that connect resistors of the past with those of the present who declare never again is now. History repeats itself, but the volume as a whole reminds us that just as there was injustice in the past, there was also resistance. Frank and I hoped that by featuring Japanese American voices with diverse viewpoints, emotional tenors, and styles of expression, we could provide readers with efficient access to a more textured understanding of the incarceration than most of us learn in school. In effect, the mission of our anthology is consonant with the mission of Densho itself, which we cite in our suggestions for further exploration, and to which all scholars of incarceration owe a debt of gratitude.
Hello, I'm Andrew Leong, an assistant professor at UC Berkeley. I'm also the translator of two of the stories that appear in the Literature of Japanese American Incarceration anthology. The experience of working with Floyd and Frank on these stories led me to begin working with a group of community members and translators who are planning and preparing complete English translations of all 9 issues of Tesaku, or Iron Fence. Tesaku is a Japanese language literary journal that was published at the Tule Lake Segregation Center in 1944 and 1945. Today, I want to share some thoughts, not just about why translation is a crucial means for bringing lesser-known stories to broader audiences, but also about how translation works. In particular, I want to talk about how translators and editors depend on resources like those provided by Densho to make sure that our work meets the highest possible standards of historical accuracy and ethical accountability. First, a few words about how I came to translate the 2 Tesaku stories. Frank and Floyd asked me to do these translations after they read about Tesaku in a doctoral dissertation written by Junko Kobayashi, now a professor at the Nagoya University of Foreign Languages in Japan. Based on Kobayashi's work, Frank and Floyd selected several Tesaku stories for further translation. The 2 that they asked me to prepare were Fujiwara Tanisaki's Our Father Was Taken Too, and Joji Nozawa's Father of Volunteers. I confess to feeling apprehensive about taking on these translations. I'm a Shin Nisei. My mother is Japanese and emigrated to the United States in the 1970s. So my family's experiences of the historical traumas of World War II are very different from those experienced by many of you listening today, those of you who are survivors and descendants of Japanese American wartime incarceration. In an ideal world, wartime and post-war pressures against Japanese language learning and literacy would never have existed. Bi or multilingualism among Japanese Americans would have been as common as, or more so, than it is among other groups. Translations of these stories would either be unnecessary, or there would be many, many people among the descendant community who would be willing and able to translate, with all the time and resources needed to support them in such endeavors. The world we live in is still very far from this ideal world, but I hope ongoing translation work and future translation projects can help us get a little bit closer to a better world. As a non-descendant translator of traumatic, emotionally, and historically charged stories of wartime incarceration, I need to be very careful about, on the one hand, not pretending I'm some sort of distant, unfeeling machine. This is because a crucial part of literary translation is recognizing and drawing from parallels to one's own experience. On the other hand, I also need to recognize that parallels are not equivalence or ownership. As a translator, I have duty to relate, but not appropriate the work and experiences of incarcerated authors. This can seem obvious. Relating to, or being related to, another person doesn't mean that you are that person. But this seemingly obvious distinction also becomes blurry in literature, especially in fictional narratives that call for intense emotional responses from the reader, responses that we might call identification. That feeling that you are right there with, seeing through the eyes of, thinking the thoughts of another person. Factual historical narratives may allow for clear senses of distance. That happened. That happened to that elder. That is their story. Fictional stories written during incarceration draw us into very different imaginations of time and place. This is happening. I'm seeing as this person sees. I'm thinking as they are thinking. As translators, we need to preserve and relay this power of fiction while being careful not to distort or abuse that power. We need to do our best to understand and reconstruct the context of how and why authors imagine scenes and characters so that we can relay as much as possible of that world. That is where the historical and archival resources of a community-based institution like Densho are so important to our work. First, and at the most basic level, Densho can help us figure out who authors were, where they came from, what they had direct experience of, and what they did not. The Densho Names Registry, which provides a searchable version of the WRA Form 26 register and final accountability rosters, can give us initial information about where authors lived prior to incarceration and where they were incarcerated. This information can provide a starting place for further research for translators like me and editors like Frank and Floyd, helping us understand the frames of reference for geographical details and whether the authors are writing about their own experiences or the imagined experience of other incarcerees. For instance, this record for Bob Fujiwo Tanisaki helped confirm that Tanisaki was not incarcerated at Tule Lake, but sent in his Tesaku submission from Manzanar. Knowing that Tanisaki came from Los Angeles helps us picture one possible frame of reference for the opening setting of the story, They Took Our Father Too. The story begins, quote, "Even after the war started, they continued the project of cleaning City Hall. Workers, precariously perched on long planks suspended by ropes, had been washing the dirt-stained walls by hand. The upper portion of the tower was now a pure white, stretching up into the blue sky." Knowing that Tanisaki came from LA helps us to understand that this opening scene is probably a description of the view of City Hall from Los Angeles' Little Tokyo neighborhood. With this information in mind, a translator like myself can avoid translating in a way that suggests a more generic image of, say, a small city hall on a New England village square, and instead I can make sure to emphasize that the city hall is itself a tower in the blue sky. This kind of information was also helpful for understanding the context of Joji Nozawa's Father of Volunteers. The Father of Volunteers is a heartrending story about an elderly Issei couple whose 3 adult sons are all sent to die on the European front. From Nozawa's camp records, we can understand that this experience was very much not his own. Born in 1919, Nozawa would have been too young to have adult children of draft age. Nozawa was also segregated as a so-called disloyal to Tule Lake, where he remained for the duration of the war. Nozawa's experience was thus the complete opposite of the experience of the yes Issei couple and Father of Volunteers, who received clearance to leave camp and work in a large city on the shores of Lake Michigan. Nozawa's work is thus an inversion of John Okada's No-No Boy. Okada was a yes who imagined the experience of a draft resistor. Nozawa was a no who imagined the experience of Issei, loyal to the United States. My experience working with Frank and Floyd on translations of these 2 stories made me realize that there was a lot more work to be done. And to be done right and at larger scale, translation of Tesaku needs community-based oversight and feedback. We've convened a community advisory board of Tule Lake survivors as well as writers and filmmakers with extensive experience in bringing Tule Lake stories to broader audiences. We've also been preparing advanced draft translations for Tule Lake survivors and descendants to review as a necessary first step before we consider pursuing wider publication and distribution. Throughout this process, Densho resources will help us identify authors, reach out to their descendants, and provide trustworthy historical references that are absolutely essential for producing high-quality translations. Thank you for listening.
Well, so to answer your question, to pick up from tying the two videos together, with the assignment to create an anthology with the title, The Literature of Japanese American Incarceration, Floyd and I could have done the simple thing of collecting the best-known writing from camp, the greatest hits, if you will, and just called it a day. But like you saw those books behind Andrew's, the bookcase. I have those same bookcases at home filled with
one upstairs.
Filled with all the books by writers in camp and about camp that I'd collected over the decades. And I knew there was a lot of, if you will, buried history that needed to be uncovered, unearthed, excavated, things I'd liked over the years. And so this turned out to be the opportunity to empty the shelves and also rows of file cabinets of photocopies of stories like That Damned Fence. I have like 6 copies of it, 6 of which were in the Densho archive, by the way, from various authors that people had sent to me over the years. I mean, Mitchie Wigland sent me them, Ike Herzog sent me them. And so with this volume, we can recover work that has been overlooked on the shelf, buried in the archives, or as Andrew points out, language unread in the Japanese language. And I think this is one of the long-term consequences of incarceration is the loss of language and culture, of the Japanese language culture. That my generation spent a lot of effort into distancing ourselves from anything associated with Japan because of the bad associations. So Andrew talked about how I was introduced to Junko Kobayashi at the 2018 Tule Lake pilgrimage, and I learned about her work on these camp literary magazines. And Junko didn't have access to the original, mimeographed pulp magazines from camp, but these 13 volumes on the screen, she worked from this, a set printed in Tokyo in 1997 of really excellent reproductions of the camp literary magazines. And it shows that it was the Japanese who were keeping this legacy alive. And I know of no other scholars besides Junko who were going into that and looking at them and asking questions. I was immediately drawn to the volumes that say Tesaku on the spines because Iron Stockade, because Tule Lake, of course, was selected by the WRA as its segregation center, as Floyd mentioned. So it's the site of a revolt, of bloody beatings, and the creation of the Tule Lake Stockade, prison within a prison. And in one of those volumes, there's this photo of the 3 Kibe Nisei writers who edited this high-quality, curated literary magazine called Tesaku in the middle of an emotional war zone of Tule Lake during the disturbance of November 43. And on the right of this photo is Joji Nozawa, whom Andrew talked about, Kibe. He was 25 years old at the time when he wrote Father of Volunteers. Just a kid, really. And so let me read to you from the end of his story, Father of Volunteers, in which Nozawa takes us behind the sad kind of stereotypical faces we've come to see in these photographs of Gold Star fathers and mothers who are, quite rightly, upset about the sacrifice of their sons who volunteered or were drafted in combat. But it's become kind of an icon, kind of a stereotype. And in this story, the character, Joji Nozawa's story, the character Mr. Saeki has relocated from camp with his wife to work as a servant in Detroit. And as Andrew says, they have 3 sons, 2 of whom volunteer for the Army and are killed in action. They refuse to let their 3rd son go, but he insists, and sure enough, they get a telegram, regrets. And like the parents in that photograph I showed you, notifying he was lost, Mr. Sayeki gives a quote to a nosy newsman in this story. And the next day, his white employer is excited to show him this newspaper. And the story goes, printed in the paper was an article about his 3 sons' deaths, accompanied by a 4x6-inch portrait of Mr. Sayeki. The article included the following quote: "When I think about how my 3 sons have died for America, I think of how content they are now in heaven. When I think this, I do not feel sadness, but rather a far greater feeling of honorable happiness." These were the words that Mr. Sayeki had said to the journalist the day before, but reading them now, he felt like he wanted to vomit. Those words just turned back upon him as expressions of his own self-loathing. Why didn't he just bash his head in against the wall? He wanted to beat himself senseless. He looked at the picture of himself in the newspaper and saw a perfect specimen of village idiot. Like tongues of flame, a violent anger flickered, caught, and burst within him. Mr. Sayeki did not care that his employer was standing next to him. He crushed the paper into a crumpled ball, slammed it down into the wastepaper basket in the corner, and then stamped on the basket, smashing it with all his might. I mean, this is an Issei character in the story, right? I mean, this is not the picture we have of the Issei. So when Andrew sent us this translation, my first thought was, like, how much more Kibe Nisei and Issei writing is out there with the same anger and passion of a John Okada, for example, that we don't know about yet because we don't read Japanese. And so Andrew clearly does too. He's gone off and secured a major NPS grant to translate all 9 issues of Tesaku. So for the Tule Lake section of our anthology, with the exception here of Tatsu Inoue Stockade Diary, which is readily available in shops, these are the kinds of books that have received little attention or no attention over the years, and in which I hope we can revive new interest by their inclusion in the anthology. That book in the corner there, Betrayed Trust, is one I hope someone out there, by the way, will be interested in helping us republish. Betrayed Trust, the story of a deported Issei and his American-born family. It's really a rare insider's account in English of teenagers like Tom Akashi, who wear the Hachimaki headbands and Rising Sun sweatshirts and blow their bugles at Tule Lake. Not as threats or to intimidation, but as what he calls badges of honor. So these are the Hoshidan, commonly dismissed as the pro-Japan element, that to this date remain the most vilified and I think most misunderstood outcome of the wartime incarceration. So we excerpt his passage showing their sweatshirts and bugles to be ordered from the Sears Roebuck catalog, and their menacing-looking marches to be little more than prison calisthenics that wake up a lot of people at 5 a.m. And he shows their fervor for the emperor and the study of the Japanese language to be really acts of cultural affinity more than political action. Personal pride in the only thing they have that the government has left to them, which is literally the skin on their backs, their race, their ethnicity. So Tom Akashi was interviewed by Densho, and this is a still from the Densho interview. In the book, Akashi has this key line: "For the first time, I feel good about being Japanese, not in a political or loyalty sense, but being part of the Japanese race." And you realize, he's right. Writing like this, as Andrew says, has the power to turn stereotypes in their head by generating empathy for others and for the Issei and Nisei camp. Our definition of literature, then, for the volume includes song lyrics, and we have published 2 in the anthology. And you talk about unearthing history, Nina. This Song of Cheyenne is something that Frank Chin and I found on a worn scrap of paper that a Heart Mountain draft resistor carried in his wallet for 40 years. It was just really worn. I had to sharpen it for this with Photoshop with this image here. These are the lyrics here of a jailhouse song that his fellow resistors composed while awaiting trial in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And James Cotto confirmed to us that the lyrics were set to music, but he couldn't remember the tune. So we asked the actor Mako to recite them at a public event, and Mako looked, "Oh, this must be the Holabushi. Look at the words, Aloha, Heart Mountain. These guys must be Hawaiian, right?" And he was right, because Eddie Yanagisako and Kenroku Sumida were, in fact, born in Hawaii and lived in L.A. So this doesn't come through in print, the singing of the Song of Cheyenne. So I want to play this 30-second clip for you of Mako singing the Song of Cheyenne.
Aloha Cheyenne, kago no naka, toto naname sunde iru. Hige wa bobo to haemashita. Dare ga ichiban nagai kato.
So that was the Cheyenne County Jail, and that was where the Hard Mountain Draft Resistors, some of them, composed this jailhouse song to the tune of the Hola Hola Bushi, as Mako singing it. And for the audiobook of our anthology, I was lucky to get a Hollywood veteran, Keone Young, to perform the Issei Nisei voices and to sing the Song of Cheyenne. Here's Keone Young in the studio. And I gave Keone the Song of Cheyenne to read for the audiobook, and he looks at it and he goes, I taught Mako about the Hola Hola Bushi. I taught Mako how to sing the Song of Cheyenne. And it's true. I mean, they were protege. He was a protege of Mako's. So let me conclude with Joe Kurihara, the World War I veteran known for inciting the revolt at Manzanar. Here he is. He served in the U.S. Army, World War I. He's not known as a poet, but he also wrote the most angry and bitter denunciation I've seen of what he felt the government did to Japanese America. Art Hansen loaned me a binder full of photostats from the Bancroft Library 20 years ago. I held on to it for 20 years, unfortunately. And Art recently asked for it back, so I copied it. And in the anthology, I had a chance to finally read these writings from the Bancroft and realized that Kura had these poems in here, these crazy, not really literary poems, almost doggerel, but they were really authentic. I mean, he was a pivotal figure in history. Poems he'd written in camp. One was an ode to the two young men who were shot dead by MPs in the Manzanar Revolt, the martyrs of Camp Manzanar that we include in the book. The other is one that he wrote embracing his expatriation from Tule Lake as the culmination of years enduring racism and hatred, as the contemptuous Japs they are, citizens or not. I'll read you 3 stanzas. They've kicked and cussed an honest spat, calling us Japs, the stabbers in the back. Saboteurs and spies, these damnable Japs, throw them into camps and ship them back. In shameful words, they forced us out, into a desert like a bunch of sheep. They stole our homes and blasted our rights. With merciless sweep, they broke us all. 6 more stanzas like that. I'm skipping to the end. Goodbye, America, goodbye. Jap I was born, and as Jap I shall live. Proud as a cock to the world I crow. Jap I am, and as Jap I will die. I mean, this is not the Japanese America literature that we've seen before. And what I like about our book, the outcome, is you can kind of look down the table of contents and see an almost entirely new lineup of selections, along with familiar ones like poems by Mitsuyo Yamada and Toyo Tsuyomoto. And it's in a trade paperback, which is the kind of book you can buy at the Elliott Bay and give to a child or a niece. And for teachers, it's a roadmap to see how the pieces of the camp story all fit together, so they can supplement it with their own local favorite stories or favorite books. And just this week, speaking of teachers, we received this teacher's guide created by a noted East Coast educator. Here it is, the teacher's guide for our book, created by Penguin Random House. And we're dropping a link to this in the chat, I believe. And I mentioned finally the audiobook. It stands on its own as a kind of radio production. We got an A-list of Japanese American acting talent. Here's Tracy Kato Kiriyama, Ren Hanami, and also Greg Watanabe. And you can download a copy from the Penguin website, but you can also borrow it from your local public library. Excellent resource, right? We love libraries. And if they don't have it, you can encourage your library to order it for you. And I just checked, the Seattle Public Library has one copy that no one's got a hold on yet. So these are just a few examples of how much there remains to be uncovered when we talk about uncovering history. So thank you very much to Densho for all the work you do.
Yeah. No, and thank you, Frank. I think we were kind of joking earlier. We could talk about this for days, honestly. There's just like so much in there. But yeah, I think that's an important point, that there just is so much work left to do and so many stories left to tell.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Well, yeah, we're gonna move now to our live Q&A portion of the evening, and I've seen like a couple questions starting to come in the chat, but want to encourage folks to keep percolating, keep coming up with some questions for Frank here. And I'll get us started with maybe a question or two. But one question that I wanted to ask, as I was like reading through the anthology and, just kind of looking at the different writers that are represented in this collection, something that was interesting to me is that there's a fair number of women writers in the collection, and compared to previous anthologies, that hasn't always been the case. And so I was just curious if that was kind of intentional on your part and Floyd and Andrew's to have kind of that more gender balance in the anthology.
Well, I mean, the women were writing in camp. I mean, Mitsuya Yamada had made notes here at the Puyallup Fairgrounds when she was a nurse in the camp hospital at Puyallup and then at Minidoka. And she told me this great story that, late at night she would make notes in these, were then Big Chief writing tablets that she brought with her from Seattle to camp. And she wrote these notes in these Big Chief writing tablets while all the camp was quiet. And in the 70s, she would collect them and write poems from them. Same with Toyosu Yamamoto, the poet, the librarian from Cincinnati. So, I mean, women were writing all the time in camp. But there are some sections that we noticed that we didn't have, like the arrival, the pre-war community section was Toshio Mori and Henry Kiyama. And we got to have a woman there. So Greg Robinson suggested Ayako Ishigaki, someone I hadn't heard about. But I went to the Densho Encyclopedia and looked her up and found that she'd written a book called Restless Wave. And Ishigaki was the first Issei woman to write a memoir in English in 1940, I believe. And that's included in the pre-war section. So that's important. Here in Seattle, we also had Nao Akutsu, who was the wife of a Seattle cobbler whose husband was arrested after Pearl Harbor and taken to Fort Missoula. And she and her sons Jim and Gina Kutsu wrote letter after letter to the U.S. Attorney trying to get him released. And this is Nao Akutsu here. She wrote one impassioned letter. Finally, in desperation, she wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, to the First Lady. She went right to the top. That's Issei for you, right? Go to the boss. Send back the father of these American citizens. And I get the most comments from readers about her passionate, sad letter begging for mercy and the letter apparently worked because her husband was released within a month. And also, Fuyo Tanagi, I'll always be indebted to Mira Shimabukuro for discovering the journalist at the North American Post here in Seattle, Puyallup, Minidoka. Her son Shig was about to be drafted, and she told the Nisei boys, "You guys aren't doing enough to protest, being drafted without your rights being restored. You should protest more." And she organized 100 Issei women at Minidoka to sign a petition to President Roosevelt, requesting respectfully that he not draft young men like her son until their rights were restored, so they could feel better about themselves, so that they went to war, they wouldn't feel like they were sacrificing themselves or dying for nothing, as she put it. So the role of women was very strong, and we try to capture that in the anthology.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. I think that's something that I really appreciate about this anthology, is that there is such a breadth in terms of like the different voices and perspectives included.
There were 120,000, ways you could have sliced this anthology. This was our lens that we applied to it. Yes.
Yeah. Frank, I want to pass along a question from the audience. We have a question from Tracy Slater Hoshino, who's asking, in your research for pieces to include in the anthology, which piece was most surprising to you or most intriguing, and why?
Well, thank you, Tracy, for that question. I hope that you're working on your book on Elaine Black Yoneda, the wife of Carl Yoneda, the anti-fascist at Manzanar, who was, in league with Joe Kurihara in seeking the beating of Fred Tayama at Manzanar. That's important work. I think the Nozawa story to me was the most shattering discovery. And also the Joe Kurihara poems, finding them in Art Hanson's collection. Any one of them, there were Hawaiian Issei memoirs that Brian Nia were edited for Hawaii Press and the Japanese Cultural Community, JCCH, that we wanted to include, and that was a range of experience of Hawaiian Issei who were shipped from Hawaii to the alien internment camps on the mainland. And there was some really great poetry that we actually had to lift from Bamboo Ridge Press collection, Poets Behind Barbed Wire. That to me was also incredibly important.
Thank you, Frank. And great question, Tracy. Thank you. Another question is we're waiting for more questions to come in from our audience. Keep them coming, folks. Another question that I, was wondering is, I guess kind of related to what Tracy was asking is, what were some of, the maybe unexpected challenges of putting this anthology together? Because for me, one thing that I think of is, there is 60 some different
unique authors and 68
and,
selections.
Yeah, and so kind of navigating, contacting their families or getting permission to reprint them.
Well,
I imagine there are things like that.
That is exactly the unexpected. I mean, the previous anthology collection that we all know is Only What We Could Carry, Heyday Books, Lost Sonata, and Patricia Wakita. And I went to Patricia and said, we're going to do this, and any advice? And her advice was, get the permissions early. It's going to take you years to get permissions and get a permissions manager. We couldn't afford to get a permissions manager, so I had to do it myself. And it was a struggle fortunately, I know many through networking, 40 years doing this, I know people, I can ask them, I know Mitsuya Yamada, I can ask Mitsuya for permission for her poems. Thank you, Mitsuya. Here in this room, David Mura was reading poetry here last year for the AWP conference, Japanese American Poetry, and David Mura read a poem called Internment Camp Psychology. And I heard that, and it clicked. That's exactly the note we needed for the slot in our collection about resettlement, the adjustment of the Nisei to coming out of camp back into the mainstream. And it was perfect, and David was here, and so it happened right in this very spot. David Mura, thank you very much. But for Tesaku, and a story, Yoshio Abe's The Man of Dual Nationality, which is a novel written by a Kibe after camp at Santa Anita. He has no relatives. He and his wife got sick in Japan and passed away. And trying to find permissions for these writers, Issei and Kibe Issei, was a nightmare. And so the power of the internet is what came through there. And I think at Densho you'll appreciate this because you're all internet-based, right? I mean, the internet, I wrote a blog post appealing for leads on Joji Nozawa, Fujio Tanisaki, Kazuo Kawai, and someone saw it and showed it to Yuriko Yamaki, a friend in New York City, Facebook friend. And she said, I have a friend who knows the daughter of Joji Nozawa, who lives in LA. I said, and this is after almost 8 months to a year of my blog post being posted. Thank goodness. So power of community and power of the internet. Not only for the permission from Amy Seto, but the biographical information about Joji Nozawa, and I'm hoping more photographs. But little tidbits, like after the war, he was editor at the Rafu Shimpo of the Japanese language section of the Rafu Shimpo. And he also became a distributor. He had a shop in Little Tokyo, which name escapes me. It was a very famous shop, where he was the main importer after the war of national rice cookers and certain brands of karate gi. So he had a good living importing rice cookers from Japan. But an ancillary story to this is that Joji Nozawa, if we want to talk about unexplored avenues yet to be explored for literature incarceration and uncovering history, I believe there is a wealth of stories written by Issei memoirs of camp, memoirs of camp, written in Japanese that were published in the Rafu Shimpo in the late 40s, early 50s, that Joji Nozawa, being friends with them from Tule Lake, continued to publish them in the Rafu in Japanese. And I hope that someday someone will go out and search for these memoirs. I know this because we wanted to include one piece by Akira Fujita, who was a writer for Tisaku as well, that was published in the Rafu, Season of Renunciation, also called Diary of Renunciant, that was published in 1980 in San Francisco in Janice Mirikatani's collection, the Japanese-American Anthology Project, Peter Horikoshi, the Ayumi Anthology. It's called Ayumi, it's a big book. And we found Season of Renunciation in this. And unfortunately, it got cut because the book was twice as long as it should have been, and our publisher said we had to cut it in half. So don't worry, the cuts made it the volume tighter, meaner and leaner and better. But this Season of Renunciation was published in the Rafu after the war, and I'm sure there are others like it under Joji Nozawa's stewardship of the Rafu after the war. So I forget the answer, what the question was, but that's the answer. Permissions and seeking permissions. The other great story is Fujiwo Tanisaki is not the spelling you'll find in many records, because he's also known as
Bob, like his American name?
Bob. Thank you so much. Bob Fujiwo Tanizaki. And so in searching for leads on him, the misspelling, and also Joji Nozawa was in WRA records as George Joe Nozawa. And I learned last weekend from Duncan Williams that the Ireicho project, that they had the same problem of different spellings leading to dead ends or missed connections in kind of tracing down the path to finding the people through records and through the net. So I finally found one obituary for us, Tanisaki, and it mentioned the family name Rico. And I traced this Rico name to Diane Rico I found in Seattle, and in this obituary. And I tried Facebook, and I found Diane Rico in Facebook, had a profile. I DM'd her, and after a couple months, she replied back, and she said, "Oh yeah, that's my grandfather." So, great. So Diane Rico, thank you very much for the permission to reprint your grandfather's piece, and also for more biographical information.
That is great, yeah. The power of the internet and the power of community.
A lot of detective work too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we have another audience question, or I guess, a question from. I apologize if I'm saying your name wrong, but Kathleen Goulding.
Kathleen Goulding.
Thank you. I'm glad you know that.
She's with the Yuri Project, and she and her friend Frida Lin write educational guides for PBS programs and for my graphic novel too. We Hereby Refuse. We work together.
Great.
So thanks, Kathleen.
Yeah, so Kathleen's wondering if any contributions in the anthology of Yonce Writers or later descendants of camp prisoners.
Oh, absolutely, because we haven't really touched upon the thirds before camp, during camp, and after camp. And so after camp is reconnections and resettlement, and Floyd is especially insistent that we include Yonce Writers. And so we have Bryn Saito, who was the instigator of the Yonce Memory Project, a poem from her. Christine Kitano, a poem about her father, who I didn't realize until later, she's the daughter of Harry Kitano of UCLA. So Christine Kitano's in here. And of course, Brandon Shimoda, a wonderful writer from Colorado, who contributed a journalistic piece. He's a poet, but he wrote a nice journalistic piece about that we needed for the ending to get in the repeating history, the never again is now moment that we experienced in America several years ago with the separation of families at the southern border and the caging of kids, and the Sudu for Solidarity movement. Brandon really covers that well in his piece. So that was essentially to capture the arc of the camp experience, which the anthology does.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, we're starting to get some really good questions coming in. So Brenda Mora says, thank you for all of your work on the anthology. And they're wondering, what are the responsibilities for archivists, writers, and others who, do this kind of memory keeping work? Are there any reflections from the process of working on this anthology?
I'm not an academic, and I excuse myself. Greg Robinson says I shouldn't feel bad about that because Michi Wegman was not an academic. Ike Herzig was not an academic. So it's lay people who do a lot of the original work. I'm not a good ethicist. Andrew Leong almost drives me crazy the way that he is so insistent upon checking with survivors and doing the really careful work to he created a community advisory council for his Tesaku translation project to be sure that he's, not misstepping or his bounds. There are many things to be careful of. I, unfortunately, am not the right person to ask about that because if I have, a strength, it's in being kind of reckless and kind of just go out and do it, and then what's the phrase? Act first and ask for permission later, or something like that.
Ask for apologies, not permission.
And so, but I mean, we made sure to get permission from all the authors we collected, and so to answer your question, just to have respect for the authors, for the writers, and for the history, respect for the history, and that it is not something to be exploited for, personal gain or commercial gain.
Yeah. No, I think that's feels very fitting for, I think what we talk about at Densho too, that in a way you're kind of stewarding
Stewardship,
the history.
That's the word I'm looking for. Thank you very much. Yeah, we're stewards of this history, and the other thing I would say, responsibility, is to put it out there. Just don't just research for yourself, but it's not. It doesn't live until you share it with others, and whether you write a play or make a film or write a book, you've got to produce the fruits of your labor, and so that others can share it.
Yeah. Well, I think we have time for a couple more questions, but friends in the audience, let me know if I'm wrong on that. So we have a question from Catherine Jo Ishino, who's wondering kind of how you might respond to people who might say that the Japanese American community should move on from World War II incarceration. It happened so long ago. It's time to create new legacies. So yes, what's your response?
It's not. My response is not printable for a family audience, because. I think that what we try to show with the anthology is that the history of incarceration is one that continues to live today and inform us today, because especially as Japanese Americans, we have endured a repeating cycle of anti-Japanese, anti-Asian discrimination, and in the 1980s. People were saying, let's move on. But in the 1980s, we had the imports of Japanese cars and consumer electronics leading to cries of an economic Pearl Harbor, which led to the beating death of Vincent Chin by two Detroit auto workers. After 9/11, we had of course, the attack on the World Trade Center, a sneak attack from abroad across the ocean that no one knew who was responsible. And we had the immediate calls for internment of Iranian Americans, Arab Americans, and anyone who wore a turban, who looked like them. In the election of 2016, we had the rise of calls for a ban on travel from majority Muslim nations, and as I said, a separation of families at the southern border and the caging of kids, asylum seekers, and so. And during the pandemic, we had a president whose cries of China virus and Kung flu, that started over there, is I think leads today, even today, to attacks on Asians on the street. So I mean, this business of incarceration being behind us, it happened 80 years ago, but the othering of people who are different from the mainstream, whether they based on their race, their religion, their immigration status, their sexual orientation, or their gender identity, that's still with us. And so the study of this history continues to inform us in that regard. And secondarily, 80 years later, we're still making discoveries about this experience, not only with this anthology, but I mean, on a very nerd level, Hiroshi Shimizu, I was with him when he discovered the site where Shoichi Okamoto was shot at Tule Lake. We just discovered the site, the actual site of the Tule Lake stockade on the site, so that we can honor that site. It wasn't where we thought it was, and I mean, more importantly, at Topaz, they've unearthed. Well, they've discovered a stone that was buried in the ground by Issei as a memorial to the fatal shooting of James Wakasa at Topaz. And this, I think I agree with Nancy Ukai, that this is the most significant memorial that has been discovered in the camps, and that continues to inform and engage us. So, the history and the work is still continuing, and discoveries are being made every day.
No, I think that's a great answer, and I appreciate that kind of like future-looking, forward-looking, that the story's not over. We're still kind of reinterpreting it, recontextualizing it, carrying it with us.
Until we stop, targeting others based on their differences, the literature of incarceration will continue to be written. Yes.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really powerful place to end. Thank you so much, Frank, for sharing. You have such like a wealth of knowledge, and Floyd and Andrew as well. Yes. I so appreciate this conversation and this anthology that you all have created and put out into the world.
Well, thank you. I want to add that I'm a baby boomer, and it just occurred I need to talk to somebody here about my estate planning. And I don't know who to talk to, but I mean, I am at that point now. I was thinking about that, and my charitable RMDs, I think they're called, and we all need to think about including Densho in our estate planning, and I certainly am. So thank you all for
your. That's very gracious, Frank. I think my good friend Cassandra, our fund development manager, can help.
Okay, yes, yeah. I don't know who to talk to. So okay.
Again, thank you so much, Frank. And now I think we're going to transition to hearing a few words from our Executive Director, Naomi Ostwald Kawamura. So she'll tell us a little bit more about, kind of how Densho's work is, parallel to, aligned with, kind of continuing in the same vein of unearthing history and uplifting new voices. I'll let Naomi take it from here.
Thank you to Frank, Floyd, and Andrew for sharing some of the incredible stories you've uncovered in compiling the literature of Japanese American incarceration. And thank you to all of you at home for joining us for this powerful conversation and for being such an engaged audience. As much as I would have loved to gather in person and mingle with all of you over some sushi and sake, I'm grateful that this virtual platform allows us to connect with our full Densho community across great distances and multiple time zones. We've come together to celebrate not only Densho, but the power of stories. Stories that define us, connect us, and move us towards a more just and informed future. At Densho, we believe in the transformative power of storytelling. We believe that when we are rooted in our history, when we know the stories of those who came before us, we are better positioned to learn from our past and apply those lessons toward the pursuit of future justice. We believe, and I have witnessed firsthand, that the act of remembering and retelling the diverse wartime experiences of our Japanese American elders can foster healing and provide those of us who inherit this history with a deeper understanding of our place within this larger story of the United States. There's no single story that can cover the full breadth and scope of this history on its own. Each of the 125,000 individuals who were uprooted from their homes and forcibly incarcerated during World War II has their own unique story, stories of grief and loss, of unexpected beauty in spite of it all, stories of rage, resistance, of quiet survival, and even hope. At Densho, we work tirelessly to ensure that these stories are not just heard but felt, resonating deeply with audiences across generations and communities. But we don't do this work alone. Densho is part of a broader, collaborative ecosystem of storytellers, researchers, artists, and educators dedicated to bringing the histories and ongoing relevance of Japanese American incarceration to life. These partnerships are vital to ensure that the narratives of those who lived through this dark chapter in U.S. history are preserved and shared with future generations. Whether it's through oral histories, scholarly research, or creative works, each story we unearth adds a layer of depth and understanding to our collective memory. And that is why I am excited to see so many new projects and emerging areas of scholarship dig deeper into lesser known and untold chapters of the Japanese American story. Projects like this groundbreaking anthology. In some ways, the literature of Japanese American incarceration mirrors the work we do at Densho, amplifying the voices of survivors of World War II incarceration, preserving them so that others can learn about this history directly from those who lived it. By sharing these written testimonies of the camp experience and its lingering impact, many of them published for the first time in this anthology, Frank, Floyd, and Andrew have uncovered new layers and nuances in this history, deepening our understanding of how Japanese Americans navigated the mundane and cataclysmic challenges of incarceration. These survivors' stories, told in their own words and now preserved for posterity in these pages, will never be lost or erased, will be passed down from generation to generation alongside important lessons about the human cost of xenophobia and racial injustice, lessons of democracy and our collective power and responsibility to use our own voices to shape a more just future. I'd like to also take a moment to recognize the importance of translation work, which has played a crucial role in bringing to light aspects of the incarceration history that have remained hidden for far too long. When Densho started in 1996 as a small grassroots oral history project, working out of an old classroom in the Seattle Japanese Language School, we'd already lost many of the Issei who experienced the wartime incarceration as adults. Of the hundreds of oral histories in our archives today, most feature Nisei narrators. These stories offer invaluable, irreplaceable insight into what the experience of forced removal and incarceration was like for children, teens, and young adults. Stories of childhood games played next to barbed wire, the irony of learning about American democracy from a classroom inside an American concentration camp. But we know that there are other stories that have largely remained buried by language barriers and the passage of time. Stories of the journey from Japan to America and in immigrant communities' early years in this country, of homes and businesses painstakingly built with decades of underpaid and exploited labor, only to be taken away by executive order. As the daughter of post-war immigrants from Japan, I grew up hearing and speaking Japanese in my home, but I know that many of my sansei and yonsei peers had a very different experience, that as a result of the wartime incarceration, forced assimilation, and cultural erasure that came with it, many families ceased speaking Japanese after the war, and the language of the Issei was often not passed down to subsequent generations. but through the work of translators like Andrew, like the team at the Tule Lake Japanese Library, and like our own Naoko Tanabe, who has helped families learn about their roots in Japan through Densho's Koseki retrieval services. We're now able to uncover and share more of these Issei stories and create a fuller picture of the Japanese-American experience. There are key chapters of Japanese-American history and the World War II incarceration that are still waiting to be told, whether it's the Issei experience or the stories of women, LGBTQ individuals, multiracial families, people with disabilities, or other voices that have often been excluded from historical records. We know there's so much left to explore. At Densho, we aim to show the full diversity of the Japanese-American experience, to tell as many of those 125,000 unique stories of World War II incarceration as possible, alongside stories that illustrate the pre-war communities that were uprooted by Executive Order 9066, post-war movements to demand justice, redress, and reparations. From the beginning, Densho's been rooted in a commitment to uplift voices that have been silenced or overlooked, to tell the full story without shying away from ugly truths and uncomfortable pieces of our shared history so that we can learn from our past. This act of remembrance and truth-seeking remains Densho's strength. And with your support, we will continue unearthing previously untold stories that add depth and nuance to our understanding of the history of Japanese-American incarceration, how it continues to shape our identities and communities today, and the ways it calls us forward to work for a more just and inclusive future. As a community-driven nonprofit, our work to preserve our history, share lessons of the past, and make all of this freely accessible is only possible thanks to the generosity of our community of supporters. As donors, you've been unwavering in your commitment to Densho's mission over the past 28 years. And I have been truly grateful and humbled to have such a supportive community these past 2 years as I've stepped into the role of Executive Director. As we look to Densho's next 30 years, I want to invite you to invest in our future and partner with us as we preserve these stories of the past for the generations of tomorrow. Every dollar you give is deeply appreciated and sustains us in our long-standing commitment to preserving Japanese-American history. I recently tasked our staff with crunching the numbers to help our supporters understand the impact you're making anytime you give to Densho. Of course, the truth is, every priceless item and collection entrusted to us is different. Without fail, whenever I ask my team about this, the answer is always, it depends. So that being said, on average, $50 allows us to digitize one letter, $250 makes it possible to preserve an entire yearbook, and it takes about $1,000 to film an oral history interview, ensuring the voices and stories of our narrators live on. This is your impact and our collective legacy. Whether your gift helps us digitize one letter or 1,000, your donation enables Densho to keep doing what we do best. With your support, we remain steadfast in our commitment to preserving our history at no cost to those who share their collections with us, while also maintaining and expanding our digital repository to ensure these priceless pieces of our shared history remain accessible to all. Thanks to a generous matching grant from Costco, donations made in support of our virtual fundraiser will be matched dollar for dollar up to $10,000. And with that, I'd like to close on a note of gratitude to all of our supporters. Preserving our history is a collective and intergenerational task that Densho is proud to take on alongside each of you. First, I'd like to thank each of our speakers who have joined us for tonight's event. Thanks to Tom Ikeda for his moving remarks tonight and for his continued thought partnership as I lead Densho into our future. Special thanks to Floyd Chung, Andrew Leong, and Frank Abe for their critical work and for their commitment to recovering and uplifting dozens of works that had been overlooked in the archives or would have otherwise remained untranslated in Japanese. Thank you for your work, and thank you for joining us this evening. And I'd like to extend a special thank you to all of our hardworking Densho staff members, including Nina Wallace, our excellent moderator, who bring our mission to life through their work and who made tonight's event possible. I'd also like to thank all of our past and present board members for offering their time, leadership, and expertise to ensure Densho's continued success and sustainability. As Densho's Executive Director, I have the pleasure of working with this incredible team in my day-to-day work. Thank you all for everything you do for Densho. Lastly, I want to thank everyone who tuned in tonight. Our Densho supporters, donors, and partners are truly the heart of our work to preserve and make accessible the incarceration history. I am grateful to each and every one of you. Thank you for walking alongside us over the past 28 years and for now joining us in planting the seeds for Densho's future. Thank you all, and I look forward to continuing our work together. Good night.
Well, thank you, everybody. This brings us to the close of our evening. It's been an eventful one, as always, with our Densho events. I love, as we're discussing connecting across generations, keeping history alive, stewardship, like Frank talked about, and that we can find joy and connection in keeping this history alive together. So I've enjoyed my time tonight. I hope you have too, as we keep connecting, keep learning, and keep unearthing this history together. As we close, we just want to thank our sponsors. Thank you to our presenting sponsors at Costco, and thank you to our friends at the Nipponkan Theater. We really enjoyed seeing their facility and that Tom got to film there. So lastly, thank you to everyone who's here tonight, those of you at home, those of you who are here. There's just so many partners, so many people behind the scenes, and to our presenters. Just thank you for sharing your time, your expertise, your energy, and your passion for preserving our history. And with that, we're just going to say goodnight and to take care, and we'll continue to see you across our programs. Thank you for giving generously to Densho your time, your support, and contributing to our preservation work. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.